Last month, we finished the two-part presentation on the planning, financing, and construction of the building that we refer to as our temple, this building that we're in tonight. The last part covered the tough years after the building completion and dedication due to the Depression and what it did to their insurance subscription scheme. I mentioned that I had contacted the Guthrie Temple for some information on their temple construction, which had been 10 years previous to the McAlester construction. I was just going to add a couple of paragraphs to the end of last month's program to give a comparison of what our forefathers encountered to give a comparison to what our forefathers encountered in our building project. I received 27 pages copied from a book on Scottish Rite activities in Guthrie regarding their temple construction. And then yesterday, I guess I got this book right here, which was the book that these 27 pages were taken from, so I got about 300 pages there. So I have, this is the reason I have so much information that, and it was really interesting and brought in other Masonic history of that period. So I decided to make a whole program out of this thing instead of tacking it on last month to our program. So what follows is the result of that effort. First, before we get started on this, first let me see a show of hands of those of you who have been in the Guthrie Temple. Okay, I figured that most everybody has. And that's great because it'll help. I won't have to rely on a word picture of what a great structure that is because you already know it. Okay, let's get started. The rebuilding of the Guthrie Temple. The years of 1910 to 1920 were banner membership years for the Scottish Rite bodies of Guthrie. 5 reunions were held in the year of 1919 to handle a large number of candidates. The beginning of Scottish Rite Masonry in Guthrie predated the beginning in McAlester by about 10 years. So when we were just beginning with the first class of the Lodge of Perfection in 1901 here, they already were well organized and had just completed their first temple the year before in 1900. So they already had a temple building. And then a year later, we got started with just our Lodge of Perfection. By the late teens, they were bursting at the seams, this is Guthrie, and thinking about a bigger and better facility. In 1919, the architecture firm of Hawk and Parr from Oklahoma City was employed to produce the plans for their grandiose new temple. J.O. Parr, one of the firm's principals, was to be the lead architect. Now, this was the same firm who planned the McAlester Temple. However, William T. Schmidt was the lead architect on our job, but it was still Hawk and Parr architectural firm. After it became common knowledge that the Guthrie Scottish Rite was going to build a new temple, this information seemed to set in motion an avalanche of change in Oklahoma Masonic circles, as everybody wanted their old building. And if you'll notice your handout, on one side I've got the old building or the original Scottish Rite Temple in Guthrie, and on the other side is the new one. So when we're talking about the older one, you might take a look at that and get a perspective of what it was. A pretty darn nice building. So the other side there. Yeah. Okay. Many Masons, one of the reasons for this avalanche of change was that many Masons were dissatisfied with the location of the Masonic Home for Kids and the Elderly at Darlington, which was in a rural setting outside of El Reno. They wanted to move it to an urban area where the orphan residents could attend a public school. Others wanted this same move so that the elderly could be separated from the children and could be closer to medical facilities. Others wanted to build a separate medical facility or clinic wherever the home was located. And still another group of people wanted the Grand Lodge to have a home of its own, where they could house their full-time secretary and also have a museum and library. In other words, a headquarters building for the Grand Lodge. All of these issues would probably have eventually appeared, but the coming availability of the old Scottish Rite Temple seemed to bring them all to the forefront at the same time. Enter the man of the hour, a Mason by the name of Frank Durr, D-E-R-R. Remember that name. Durr was serving as General Secretary of the Scottish Rite. He was preparing to become the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge the next year in 1920. And he had been appointed to the Temple Building Committee. And then after he got on the committee, he was then elected Secretary of the committee, which was the guy that was really under the gun. And by the way, the slot that he took on the building committee for Guthrie became open because due to the death of SGIG Daniel M. Haley. Now this was 1919. All these Grand Lodge issues created much consternation among the brethren. The issues again were moving Darlington, separating the elderly from the youth, new medical facilities, new office for the Grand Lodge. The consternation was caused because these major proposals would all cost money. Consequently, people were taking sides, which brought on much oratory. Even other cities got into the running for the homes if they were to be removed from Darlington. By 1922, the smoke had cleared and decisions made. The results were as follows. The Grand Lodge was to take over the old Scottish Rite Temple for its new headquarters. However, it would continue to be used by the Scottish Rite for office and degree presentations until the new structure was completed. Second, the Scottish Rite Building Committee agreed to purchase for $11,000 a 28.5 acre site in Guthrie for the homes to be located. This land was in the close proximity to schools and medical facilities, and the schools and medical people agreed to give the home people special treatment. Now let me stop for a moment and say I've got written out beside this questionable. Why would the Scottish Rite Building Committee, which is primarily formed to build a new temple, why would they be spending $11,000 for a 28.5 acre site to help house the Grand Lodge? Well, here's my take on it, and I think it's logical. I don't have proof of this, but I suspect this is what happened. The city of Guthrie gave the land for the Guthrie Temple to the Scottish Rite for $1 a couple of years previous, and if they would build this huge temple, because they felt it would be an asset to their community. So they gave this site, and this was the site for the original state capitol that was going to house the original state capitol. And so, of course, it had already gone to Oklahoma City. So, okay, so then this issue of Darlington came up, and the city of Guthrie wanted those two, the homes for the elderly and for the children. And so they went to the Scottish Rite and said, how about using part of this land that we gave you and the Scottish Rite didn't want that. They didn't want the Darlington homes located in there. They wanted that whole big piece of land for the temple. So to help that's why they bought the $11,000 acreage and gave it to the for the Grand Lodge site. For the Darlington site. So anyway, this is kind of that's why the building committee got involved with the Grand Lodge. Frank Durr, working behind the scenes and because of his many positions of importance, was the guiding light to the whole process, even though others took credit. In the end, the city of Guthrie was the big winner. It had become the Masonic hub for Oklahoma. This all took place because the Scottish Rite decided to build a new temple. So now let's get back to that story. The new Scottish Rite Temple was to be built on an elevated area just east of the Guthrie Business District, which had originally been set aside for the state capitol. The old convention hall, which housed the first two legislative sessions of this new state, was still a part of this location, and still is, and now is a part of the present temple complex. It is connected by an enclosed causeway to the building we are now describing in this presentation. When we strayed from our main storyline to describe the Grand Lodge activities, the building committee had just received the plans from the architect. So in February of 1920, 6 firms were invited to submit bids for these plans. 2 of them were from New York City, 1 from St. Louis, and 3 from Oklahoma City. The New York firm of James S. Stewart was awarded the contract. Now, I don't know exactly whether it was a lower bid, or I presume that's what it was, but anyway, you'd think they would select the Oklahoma City, one of the Oklahoma City firms, but the firm from New York City got the bid. The next month, March of 1920, the committee floated a $750,000 bond at 6% interest for 10 years to finance the project. Now note, initially they did not attempt a do-it-yourself financing project like McAlester did, and with their insurance subscriptions, and so at least, as I said, to start with. By this time, Frank Durr was now Grand Master, and William Perry Freeman had been named Deputy of the Supreme Council to replace Daniel M. Haley. During the spring reunion, these 2 men and other dignitaries conducted a groundbreaking dedication ceremony in May of 1920, and the project of constructing the most impressive temple in the largest valley in the southern jurisdiction was begun. The other festivities of the day included a parade with a band from India Shrine in Oklahoma City and a band from Guthrie, members of the Eastern Star. Note this, all 700 members of the spring reunion. They had 700 members of that class in the spring reunion class there. Members of Blue Lodges, Shriners, and visiting Masons from other states, all walking in columns of 4, creating quite a lengthy spectacle. The 4th governor of Oklahoma, J.B.A. Robertson, made a speech complimenting the accomplishments of the Masonic fraternity in this new state, and particularly the Scottish Rite and Guthrie, in the launching of this grand project. This describes how this great project was begun. 8 months later, January of 1921, another ceremony was held to lay the cornerstone, and this was an even larger ceremony than the first one. Of course, another impressive parade. They have parades for everything back in those days. And there was a total of 8,000 in attendance, general public and Masons. This was the high point, the time of great enthusiasm in Guthrie that we can compare to the similar time in McAlester when they were celebrating the successful insurance subscription campaign. Unfortunately, like McAlester, hard times were ahead. In June of 1921, this was 6 months after the cornerstone high and 13 months after the beginning of construction, the building committee's interim audit indicated that the $750,000 initial bond issue was near exhaustion. The contractor had ordered most of the necessary supplies up front. Such things, there was over 1 million bricks. They had limestone facing and columns, floor tile, and so forth. But now the labor costs of changing those raw materials sitting on the ground out there into a building were going to far exceed their remaining resources. For instance, the cost of the limestone facing alone came to $312,500. That's almost 42% of the initial $750,000 that had been allowed. Let me stop here and say that my information does not reveal the source of the problem, whether it was an original miscalculation of costs inappropriate handling of funds by either the contractor or the committee, some unexpected rise in cost, or perhaps a combination of all of the above. Well, I just don't know who to blame it on. However, the fact that they were near the end of their chips was reality. They began downsizing every way possible. The next step taken by the committee was to attempt to reduce the workmen's wages. For instance, the carpenters were receiving $1 an hour. They were notified by the committee that this was being reduced to 87 cents. Upon notification, all carpenters quit. Then the union notified the committee that the contract required a 30-day advance notification of any wage change, and also that they were working for the contractor and not the committee. Therefore, the committee agreed to wait for the 30 days before installing the wage reduction, and also to leave future negotiations with the contractor. All of this could cause confusion among the members of the building committee as to future action. So, since there was confusion with the committee, the next step taken was to just plain terminate the contract with the James Stewart General Contractors and stop all operation until a plan of additional money could be agreed on. Well, the general contractor's on-site representative was a gentleman by the name of J.H. Fredrickson, who also served as the concrete foreman, and he was informed that the committee was suspending activity and that the contract was terminated. So, and he was to notify his headquarters. After consultation with the company headquarters and legal staff in New York, he returned with the answer, "We are not accepting your unilateral decision to fire us." So evidently the contract had something in it that said they couldn't do that. So the committee was really faced with an impasse now. Their first action was to fire Mr. Fredrickson. Secondly, they had to cash some victory bonds, and the work continued, but at a snail's pace. Let me pause for a moment and mention a couple of things. One, I know everybody's heard the story that you can dislike the message, but don't kill the messenger. Well, this was a prime example of that, because poor old Fredrickson got the axe, and all he was doing was bringing the message back to them that he was that they weren't going to accept it. Anyway,
message.
Yeah. Now, second, does anyone recognize the name Fredrickson? This was the name of the firm that built the McAlester Temple. It was the J.H. Fredrickson Construction Company. Now, I presume that Mr. Fredrickson formed his own construction company and became our contractor. I have no proof, but the same name would lead one to that assumption. Another action which occurred because of all of this friction, not only with the contractor, but also with the laborers and even among the committee members, was that Frank Durr, this guy that was holding things together, resigned from the committee. Thereafter, in March of 1922, permission was granted to float another 10-year, this time $500,000 bond at 5%, with emphasis of selling the bond increments of $100, $500, and $1,000 primarily to Guthrie members. Now, this is where the story takes on a similarity to the McAlester story. In other words, they were going back to their own members to help with the financing, just like we attempted to do with our insurance subscriptions. Frank Durr, who was still holding the position of General Secretary, was put in charge of selling these bonds to their members. By the end of 1922, that's 9 months' time, he had sold over $400,000 of this. So work continued on the temple during the year 1923. It was slow, but and as funds were available, but it did continue. Finally, in conjunction with the 1923 November reunion, the building was deemed not completed, but ready for degree presentation. And this is 4.5 years after that groundbreaking ceremony. So they were ready to put on the degrees and get in the building, even though they knew it wasn't completed. In other words, they had no scenery backdrops for their degrees there for the first couple of years. As a sad note, Frank Durr's mother passed away in December of 1923, a month after the first usage of the building just described. She lived in Guthrie and suffered from stomach cancer for the last 2 years. Durr was a bachelor and had the responsibility of caring for her while in the middle of all of this building turmoil. As I read through the information I received from Guthrie, it seemed to me that Durr was the principal character and the ultimate Mason. His name continued to pop up in every instance. So what follows now is my own editorial and my own words describing this giant of a Mason. This man, Frank Durr, was in the dedication class, the first class to receive their consistory or the 32nd degree in the just completed Scottish Rite Temple in Guthrie in May of 1900. Again, that's the picture of the first temple building. So he was in that class. He became the second general secretary at Guthrie in 1908. So he was involved in the original planning of the temple as general secretary. As Grand Master, he was involved in the Darlington move, a highly controversial issue. He was the liaison between the Grand Lodge and the Scottish Rite and the city of Guthrie on the relocation of Grand Lodge offices and the Darlington homes. As a member of the building committee, he had to deal with the day-to-day problems with the contractor and the workmen. He was entrusted with raising the money for the second bond issue, while still running the valley and caring for his mother. He eliminated, however, his bachelor title from his name in 1924 when he married a long-time, highly regarded employee in the Guthrie Scottish Rite office. Durr's resignation as General Secretary in 1936, after 38 years in that office, was due to failing health. He was the one guy most responsible for the construction of the Guthrie Temple. Now, I've gone into more detail than necessary for a presentation to men who do not belong to the Guthrie Valley, but I had a purpose. We've spent the last 2 months talking about the rebuilding of our temple and the few highs and the many low times suffered by our forefathers. I wanted to show that our brother Masons in our sister valley went through their own trail of tears during their construction period also. Their pain, as per McAlester, did not end with the building dedication, as they had problems paying the construction debt during the Depression years, and finally, Guthrie became debt-free in 1946. This is 26 years after the beginning of their construction. You know, we got clear in 1947. That was 17 years after the beginning of our construction. So, as a footnote, let me say that the Guthrie Temple was begun to be used after November 1923, but the finishing touches lingered on to 1929. That's 6 years. Much of the painting of the artistic ornamentation, painting of the stage scenery, much of the interior furnishings and furniture were done in these years 1923 to 29. For instance, the Egyptian room and the Assyrian room and all of those rooms like that, those weren't completed in 1923. All that decoration and furniture and so forth were taken care of in these 6 years thereafter. This completes the story of the planning, building, and financing of the beautiful structure known as the Guthrie Scottish Rite Masonic Center. Thank you.